Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a hablar de... vamos a invitar a sentir muchas cosas en torno a la atracción sexual, el sexo. Seguimos con este encuentro sobre la atracción sexual. Voy a saludar. Si se oye muy fuerte, no os asustéis. Ya enseguida comenzamos, pero vamos a saludar por orden. Ana Pilar de Argentina, estás por ahí, ¿no? Estamos vivos.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días, acá estoy presente.
Claudia de Argentina también. ¿Qué tal?
Hola, buenos días.
Muy
bien, Marisol. Iván, agradecida.
Gracias. A ver si Marisol se escucha, le dejan ahí que quizá tiene más movimiento en la casa, no sabemos. Marisol.
Sí, hola.
Hola.
Hola, buenos días, Iván. Sí, un poquito de movimiento, por eso silencio el micrófono y los escucho atenta.
Bien, bueno, pues vamos allá.
Gracias.
All right. Now, many of you are not feeling that engaged by the discussion, which is interesting in itself, considering that you wanted it. Remember when we asked you what do you want to talk about? What do you feel is the reasons for that? What do you feel is the reason why for the lack of engagement to the subject so far?
It could be because a lot of us just like staying in our facade selves and we don't want to really see how much sexual injuries that we all have and how much we really dislike being the gender that we are.
Well, that sounded pretty intellectual as an answer. Yes. When you say stay in your facade self, what is the emotion? When we talk about sex and sexual matters, what is one of the dominant emotions on the planet with regard to sex and sexual matters? Shame. Okay, so let's just put this up. Shame.
And Jane, you mentioned one of your emotions right there at the end.
Can you remember?
Yeah, how much, I know personally for myself, I don't like being a woman, so yeah, that's being my gender. So
and anger about being a woman.
Anger and then, probably shame or fear as well.
Yeah.
With regard to sex, why is it that sex causes so much feelings of shame when sex is just like we all have sexual organs, we all we all have legs and we all have arms and we all have sexual organs as well. So why is it that when we start discussing the sexual organs and our responses, that shame seems to be the dominant emotion? When if we start talking about your legs and your arms, you think, well, why are we even talking about this? This isn't, that'd be relatively unimportant subjects. Why is the sexual subject such a thing?
Si queréis responder a alguna de estas, también así como si estuviéramos nosotras mismas. Si os surge algo así muy imperativo, como se dice, de responder a las preguntas, y lo paro. Porque es para tanto.
I feel that it's related to rejection too.
Well, let's look at that. There's the issues of rejection, yeah? The rejection of what, though? Right? Can we be more specific?
Well, rejection of myself or rejection of a man and my shame around the rejection that I have of men.
Okay, what about not only of self, but of bodily functions?
Yep.
Ya aquí casi seguro que se refiere esta mujer a rechazo contra los hombres, que dice for men, y creo que eso significa eso claramente. Bueno, eso es lo que además se traduce ahí con la transcripción pasándola y... Bueno, y las funciones corporales va a meter aquí Miller.
Right. Anything else that we can see if we can take the mic? We'll work our way across. If we bring the other
mic. Does someone else have their hand up after this?
Yeah, whoever else had a hand up.
So should I say yes?
Yes, far away.
Well, I would have thought that it's because we're brought up to cover everything up, and because especially our sexual organs down here are close to our waste disposal. You know how to put it, I don't know. So we associate it with something dirty, but we're brought up to see private. Yeah, we're told we have to cover even our breasts. We have to cover. Men don't have to cover their breasts. But we do, because these are the things that we've got nipples that feed children, and so this whole.
Well, isn't the fact that a woman covers her breast primarily because men view them as sexual objects?
Yes.
Isn't that the main cause? And the reality is, men do view them as sexual objects. So that whereas most women don't view a man's chest as a sexual object necessarily. Some may, but can you see the difference? Obviously, and but you're right. There is this thing of feeling dirty with regard to sexual matters.
Which is actually our parents' shame imposed upon us, isn't it? Yep. Cover that up.
Yep. Anything else? We were over here. Yep.
I don't know if this works.
No, it is working.
Okay. Lots of heavy guilt from churches.
Guilt?
Tons
Not
of
just
it.
from churches, actually. A lot of
or judgment against sexuality.
Good judgment, yeah. But a lot of this stuff, like the church, the one thing we must realise is the church is just a reflection of society.
Yeah.
So the reality is that men.
Esto es muy importante, ¿verdad? Que siempre, ya lo vimos una vez, que siempre queremos echarle la culpa a lo que viene después, y en realidad las heridas que pillamos y hacemos en la familia preparan para las instituciones, que no hacen más que tomar el relevo, ¿no? de lo que ya se ha creado como heridas profundas emocionales en los niños, y casi automáticamente. Ya digo, cuando queráis comentar alguna cosa.
Many of the churches impositions upon a particular group of people are actually just the society using religion as a way to project their own feelings towards that group of people. So, for example, if a group of people feel something's dirty, then they'll create a religion that actually teaches that particular thing is dirty.
Right.
Does that make sense?
And they'll hold on to that teaching.
And they'll hold on to that teaching as long as they possibly can.
And then if you feel different, and you just, your instinct feels that this is not okay, or why should it be okay the day after you get married and the day before not? That's what my mom told me. She says, and she grew up in the generation where it was absolutely not okay, except for having children and so on. She said that already didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And I remember before, when I had my first boyfriend, for a whole year, I had a diary where I just was grappling with the guilt, and because I grew up in the Catholic Church,
yeah,
it was not okay unless you were married and all that. It's
exactly.
Huge.
So belief systems certainly impose their shame upon you.
Yeah, obviously.
So it's not necessarily that we personally feel shame, but what actually happens is the belief systems impose their shame. So what we're talking about there is really a group of emotions where we are invested in other people's opinion of us.
Invertimos energía, ¿no? ¿Cómo lo diríais? Estamos echando una inversión en lo que opinan, nos importa mucho, ¿no? Lo que opinan los demás.
Yeah, but even if you know deep in your gut it's wrong, then you get into conflict what is imposed on you by your parents or society where you happen to live, and what your own feelings are.
Well, what I'm saying to you, though, in return is that when I'm invested in my parents' viewpoints more than my own, that then causes me to feel shame about my own.
Right.
That's where the conflict comes from.
That's where the conflict comes from.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you came up to me now and said, "Oh, you're a dirty cow because you're sleeping with this man and you're not married," I'd go, "Oh, I feel pretty dirty about a lot of those things, but that's not one of them, because I'm not invested in what you think about it."
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
But if you said that Mary was dirty because of some things she did in the first century,
or even this
she
life,
would say, or even in this life, she would feel quite differently.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So we take on the opinions of others based on what is already unhealed within ourselves, is the principle there. Yep. But you're right, belief systems certainly have a large effect on our willingness and openness to discuss matters of sexuality.
Yeah.
Where else? Pauline?
This is very similar, but slightly different. It's the fear of unwanted pregnancy.
Well, would it be more the guilt of unwanted pregnancy, or the fear?
Well, there's a history of this in my family,
right? Yes.
And, linked to the Catholic Church.
Should we call it unwanted results?
Okay. Yeah.
So they might not just be pregnancy?
Might not be pregnancy,
Yes.
could also be venereal diseases and so forth.
Yeah.
But let's look at the unwanted pregnancy. Historically, if a young woman was unmarried and got pregnant, she would normally be put in isolation for at least the 9-month period that she was pregnant. She would be ostracised and criticised, and many of them generationally were then taken and completely expelled from the family. They weren't even allowed. The father and the mother would treat them as sluts, and that they would never ever see them again. Now the threat of that is pretty painful emotionally. So it's no wonder.
Yeah, I have met a woman in a psychiatric institution who's been in there since the age of 16.
Yeah.
She was around 60 because of pregnancy at the age of 16.
Yeah, it's sad, eh? And just because of the condemnation of the environment at the time. Yeah. So unwanted results is a big issue. We for some reason, like if we have some kind of a skin injury, we go, oh yeah, we just got an injury. But if we have a venereal disease, now that's quite shameful. Can you see there's a big difference between those two things? There is also some soul-based reasons why we also have sensitivity to sexual matters that are actually based on pure emotions. What do you think they may be? You understand my question? Can I explain my question? There are some pure things within the soul regarding sexuality that we've already taught you today that may also be the result of, may also be one of the reasons why we have a tendency towards shame about the issues.
Yeah, I think it's that we know about our soulmate and that there is something wrong having sex the way we do it.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, at some level we know truth, that there is just one connection, one person. And when we look at our sexual past, we haven't had just one person's, most people haven't. And so all of a sudden there's a lot of shame about our past as a result. You see, this is I suppose you could say what appears to be the negative part of truth is that we often then feel ashamed about our own life and judge our own life in comparison with that truth. And we often do that.
And that's certainly a huge issue for me. And obviously there's the truth is quite strong in my soul, even though I was in quite heavy denial of it for a long time. So even my sexual responsiveness and my orgasm, I'm working through recently the fact that was very shut down because I had this sense that it should be for my soulmate and it wasn't. I wasn't engaged with my soulmate, and so I even found it difficult to orgasm and be engaged with other people. Yeah.
So often we have this feeling of what is right within us, and when we do what is the opposite to the feeling of what is right, there is a saying that our conscience, which is the inbuilt mechanism we have to know what the difference between right and wrong is, our conscience bothers us. And when our
Fijaos aquí que la comenta así, sin haber casi nunca comentaba de esto hasta después, hasta el 2017, donde se pasan pues como 4 o 5 horas hablando de este término de conciencia, del que hemos hablado ya mucho, que vemos la importancia, ¿verdad?, en estas conversaciones. Y lo hacen en el marco de conversaciones muy largas sobre el perdón y el arrepentimiento y la compensación, de las que hemos visto ya algunas. Entonces, fijaros ahí cómo aparece aquí esa palabra básica del vocabulario, en ese sentido de conciencia moral, pero extendida a que Dios siempre conecta con nosotros, con el alma, para dar la verdad en todo instante. Es más extenso que lo moral, digamos.
conscience bothers us, and we don't allow ourselves to feel why it's bothering us, we often feel emotions of shame or guilt rather than feeling the reason why our conscience is bothering us, if that makes sense to you. Yeah?
So, y fijaros, ¿no? Como inconscientemente en los entornos familiares se enseña esto, ¿no? Se enseña que, como no se conoce claramente esto, se enseña que no pasa nada, que la culpa y la vergüenza son lo que hay que tener, en vez de ser lógicos. Es decir, a ver, ¿por qué me está molestando esto? La razón por la que Dios está directamente imprimiendo, digamos, todas las leyes de Dios, imprimiendo incomodidad para nuestra felicidad. Algo que sentimos incómodo, pero es en realidad, en otro sentido, es bueno porque es para crecer, ¿no? Pero sin embargo, se favorece por inconsciencia la culpa y la vergüenza y el autocastigo, ¿no? Pero a niveles muy sutiles. Si se os ocurre algo.
Sí, Iván, estaba preparando el vivo de mañana y retomé el video del deseo y la responsabilidad. Bueno, acá abren el deseo ampliamente y se comprende que va mucho más allá, pero también en relacionado a lo sexual, por supuesto, y la autoconciencia, justamente esto que tenemos de pequeño, que cuando vos haces la traducción la autoconciencia es parte también de
Pero aquí no hablamos de autoconsciencia.
No, pero decía que nosotros venimos diseñados a la capacidad de preguntarnos eso, de preguntarnos todo, y que naturalmente estamos predispuestos, a eso iba, como que naturalmente estamos predispuestos a descubrir el porqué de todo.
Ahí está,
y que de pequeños, claro, a eso iba, como que eso en vez de sentir la razón, o sea, de ir por detrás de esto que vamos mutilando, ese deseo de conocer y de saber por qué me siento como me siento, que es la conexión, y que bueno, uno en ese descubrir recibe las respuestas. Dios está todo el tiempo diciéndonos quiénes somos a través de las leyes, o nuestra condición álmica nos está revelando. Entonces nosotros en esa sellamos, digamos, con esos juicios de esas emociones, que encima no las queremos sentir, o sea que a su vez va otra capa otra vez, y otra capa, y otra capa, y quedan bloqueadas. Bueno, yo siento vergüenza, por ejemplo, y estoy ahora escuchando las razones, intuía que mucho de lo que iban a decir estaba relacionado con eso, y para mí, claro, ahora comprendo que estaba inaccesible, o sea, no iba a estar, no lo iba a descubrir, es más, iba a ir por otro lado. Por ejemplo, tenía amistades que juzgaban mi apatía sexual y me decían, ¿tenés un problema psicológico? Pero claro, quizás terminaba más o menos aproximándome a esta verdad personal, pero uno no sabe en realidad, claro. No, como que ni siquiera tenía el deseo de conocer, honestamente. Me quedé mucho tiempo. Es más, sigo ahí.
O sea, ese tema de la responsabilidad, en que lo que acabas de decir, que Dios siempre está con todas sus leyes facilitándonos que seamos autoconscientes, que seamos conscientes con ese, para que podamos discernir bien qué es la conciencia, que viene de fuera, que viene, y que queremos nuestros deseos. Sí.
Eso, el deseo de saber por qué estoy sintiendo esto que estoy sintiendo. Claro, y queda sepultado ahí, o sea, te enseñan y ya está el juicio y ya está condenado el hecho y se cerró.
Sí, como has dicho también, pues con emociones antes incluso de tener palabras, ¿no?
Claro, sí.
De vergüenza es muy profunda y de miedo al cuerpo, sí, todas esas cosas.
Sí.
Vale.
Gracias.
Pues respiramos y seguimos, si alguien quiere, ya que hemos parado. Pero bueno, vale, seguimos.
Who else was that? Nico was at the back there. Yeah. We could go out the back. And Guy, what is next thing?
I just want to say exactly that most of my time in my life, I used sexuality as a tool to feel like a man. But in my heart, I knew
that something was wrong with this.
Yeah. And because I used it, and
Que algo está mal en eso, dice Miller. Sí.
and then it comes the other fact that I allowed with the same aspect to be used from other people.
Yes.
And there is where is a lot of guilt and anger towards myself. How could I allow that? Because you know the truth, but you allowed it.
So could
Betrayal.
So could I say, as a summary of what you're saying, that we know the truth that bartering sex is damaging.
And we sort of begin to feel that as well, don't we? Like we get into the barter, it feels okay because we got satisfied what we were trying to avoid or what, but after a while it goes, oh, it doesn't.
O sea, aquí Mary lo ha dicho rápido, o sea, satisfacer la adicción emocional que se trata de evitar algo. Entonces aquí lo dice realmente también, está bien traducido aquí, es que lo dice así de rápido, que si alguien no sabe nada de adicciones emocionales y lo ve esto de repente por primera vez, que no lo dudo, pues eso.
Feel good, yeah.
Yeah. So many of us in sexual relationships have become used to bartering sex as it's almost like a commodity.
Ya, pues si os he liado, termina Mary y que pues decimos, no se siente bien. Vale, y ahora sigue Miller.
That is universal. It's even more universal than the money we have, because all of us have different types of dollars and so forth. But sex is a universal commodity. It's a commodity we can use with anybody on the planet pretty much, if we wish to, in order to get what we want and satisfy what they want.
And for myself, I even was willing to, the barter for me was touch. I wanted to be held and touched. And I was willing to have sex just to have that one thing met. Yeah.
And we were discussing this a few days ago, myself and Mary, that it's interesting that every time we barter something for another thing, it's often that we don't get the other thing anyway.
Yeah.
So what Mary
who
found
did I attract? Yeah.
Was that in the bartering of the sex for the touch, she finished up not having very satisfying sex, but also having no person to hang around to touch her afterwards. Does that make sense? So often that occurs. Joy, in front there. Di. We were Di next, sorry. So let's go Di first.
A lot of my unloving actions are associated with sex, with men.
Okay.
And if I have a desire to love, I'm very confronted
about
that.
the unloving actions. Yeah, that's very good. So again, we know the truth that we are being unloving.
We have been unloving.
Or we have been unloving. And that's so. Can you see some of the shame and guilt and everything is all related to emotions that are nothing like there's nothing wrong in reality, but some of the emotions related to our shame and guilt are that we have reasons to be ashamed.
Aquí es vergüenza, la culpa y todo, o sea, toda la vergüenza y la culpa está relacionada.
Guilty about the choices we've made with sexuality. So there is this this is the conundrum with sex.
Pero algunas de las emociones relacionadas con vergüenza y culpa son relativas a que tenemos razones para estarlo. Avergonzados y culpa.
Sexual desire and sexual attraction is that some of the emotions that we think are impure are actually pure, and then some of the emotions that we think are pure or we've believed were pure in the past were actually impure, and there's a lot of confusion about which one's pure, which one's not pure, and so therefore there's a lot of confusion about our emotions in dealing with sexual attraction as a result. Yeah? Joy?
Just like what you were saying, I think it's particularly in the age that I was brought up, lack of information and education, like it wasn't even talked about.
Very true.
There was no communication and there were no words.
But why was there no communication in that generation? There was there's underlying emotional reasons why there's no communication.
Well, because they were ashamed, I guess.
Yes, So the problem is if the adult generation feels shame about sex and sexuality issues, they're imposing those feelings of shame and guilt immediately upon any child that's now conceived. And so by the time the child is born and growing, the child is now also feeling all these issues and shame, and nobody wants to talk about it. The child can't go to the parent and say, "Oh, mummy, you know, I actually had this happen to me the other day to my vagina or my penis and whatever," and mummy just goes into a meltdown because she feels so ashamed about the whole thing. And so what do we learn to do? We learn to not discuss it openly, and we also then, and the problem is information then goes underground. So in other words, a lot of people then start getting information through pornography and other means rather than it just being openly talked about. And therefore, there's very little need to go underground to get information about sex and sexuality. Yeah. Any other things to see?
Yeah, about 18 months ago, I finished a relationship because I just felt I was being used, but even worse, I felt I was using.
Yep.
You know, it was just, and when that hit me as an emotion, it was just blew me away.
Yeah, so what you're saying really is the more sensitive you became to love, the less willing you were now, and the more ashamed you felt of your behaviour when you were unloving and just using.
That's it, yeah. Just remember.
That's the beautiful thing about developing our soul and opening, isn't it? We begin to become far more sensitive to what's loving and what isn't, and it guides us. Even if we don't know the overarching rules, we feel like, oh, no, I know that's not going to lead to good things.
So can you see there's these two sides to the issue. There's the side of the issue which you could say are these sides to the issue, which are all of these.
It's like injuries imposed upon us, isn't it?
Yeah, injuries imposed upon us by our environment that cause us then to feel certain things about sex and sexuality that we feel that we then can't discuss openly and truthfully, the desires and passions and longings that we have within us. And then on this other side, we have a knowing, sort of like an inside understanding or knowing of the truth inside of us, what we call that, a soul knowing, if we could call it a soul instinct about the truth about it. And whenever we conflict or our actions have conflicted with those soul-based instincts surrounding love, then what finishes up happening is we feel bad about ourselves and therefore feel shame and therefore feel guilt and feel a bad conscience and triggers us and we then feel like we don't want to discuss that. When you think about it, not wanting to discuss that is all really about just not being humble enough to our emotion. Not being humble to admit that, yes, I have bartered sex. Yes, I have been unloving in my sexual interactions. Yes, I might have had some kind of sexual disease as a result of my use of sex, for example. Yes, I have had other things happen. That, I've had many. Let's say, I've had many, and these. I'm not saying these from my perspective. So a lot of people, when I quote things, they then quote me as saying that this has happened to me, and then they get all.
That's the next media. Yes, I have had a venereal disease.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
And I have.
Es que esto, de hecho, les han hecho ya reportajes y entrevistas traicioneras, o sea, de rodarles muchas entrevistas y recortar solo los pedazos que les pongan un poco mal. Entonces, por eso. En los medios de comunicación en Australia, sobre todo, parece.
But the reality is that what I'm saying is, even if I have, right, then there's this instinct inside of us knowing, well, something was wrong there, something was up there, and there's an instinct then of feeling, well, something was wrong, but then there's this feeling of condemnation of ourselves, and then also an unwillingness to discuss openly that condemnation of us or that feeling that we have.
Yeah, and in my experience, the way that I have been most manipulated sexually and the way I've actually entered into things that cause me more and more shame is through the avoidance of acknowledging my shame, whether they be sort of shame as a result of my soul instincts or shame as a result of injuries imposed upon me. While I lived in denial of that shame, and the truth of what really went on, that is when I became more and more disconnected with sex and love as one entity, as I believe that's the most harmonious way to experience sex. And I also, through the law of attraction, obviously, accumulated more shame because I didn't want to feel these things, so then I would enter into exchanges as a result of denying those emotions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the question then becomes, well, the only way to heal things regarding sexual attraction that are out of harmony with the way God designed them to be is firstly to intellectually even acknowledge that they are out of harmony, which means we have to at some point have a discussion about the issues. Now, if we're already resistive to having a discussion about the issues, how are we ever going to feel the emotion about the issues? Can you see? So while all of these things are true, that there are injuries that we have imposed upon us that cause us to feel shame, and while, yes, that's also true, that we do have a soul instinct to what's loving, and every time we've been unloving, we do feel also some shame or guilt or a bad conscience. At the end of the day, whether we feel a bad conscience or we have injuries imposed, we still need to enter the discussion before anything can be resolved. And we need to enter have an openness to entering the discussion about our emotions, about the particular things that guide our sexual attractions. So this is where many people have a lot of difficulty. For instance, many heterosexual males would have a lot of trouble admitting any single time that they felt an attraction to another male. Can you see that? And many heterosexual females will have usually difficulty doing the same and admitting to an attraction they had with another female. Many of us also would be very resistive to talking about our sexual history. It's interesting, we're totally open about talking about every other piece of history generally that we have.
People come and tell us for hours.
Yeah, what their other histories are. But when it comes to our sexual history, we don't want to examine it. And what I'm suggesting to you, if you want to heal sexual attraction so that sexual attraction comes into line with the way God designed it, and that is, right at the beginning we said that what that was, that is that you will only ever be sexually attracted to your soulmate no matter who else is around. That's the pure way that God designed. Then what we're going to have to do to get to that point is we're going to have to discuss our sexual attraction by looking at our sexual history in terms of what we have done in the past. We're going to need to have an openness emotionally and also even intellectually to feeling about our sexual history before we can discover the real reasons why things happen. Now, what I've found in my own progression and what I've noticed in almost everybody else who's trying to progress is that there is a deep resistance many times to discussing the history about anything in particular, but particularly their sexual history. And this deep resistance then causes us to not be able to heal particular things. And the ironic thing about our sexual history is that most of the time it was not created by any warped sexual desires or passions.
Había dicho por ningún que esa historia sexual la mayor parte de veces no fue creada por ningún, y le ha puesto un adjetivo que aquí no ha aparecido y que creo que es pervertido deseo, ni pervertida pasión o deformado, como veremos después también, que está puesto así.
Como que ahí,
Sí.
como que ya se, o sea, como que ahí perdemos pues como toda brújula, ¿no? Llega un momento en el que entre lo que sientes cuando eres niño, este impulso sexual, cargado después o sea, porque además no es solamente las ideas, sino como dices, todos los sentimientos que ya traen tus padres y toda la sociedad, que obviamente desde la concepción, pues ya nosotros los cargamos. Y entonces viene así como un choque cuando empiezas a sentir impulsos sexuales, ¿no? Esta parte de a lo mejor la masturbación, por ejemplo, ¿no? O a tocarte y que eso está prohibido. Entonces es como un choque súper fuerte cuando, como dicen, no se habla con naturalidad. Y ahí como que te vas desvinculando hasta de tus propios órganos sexuales, ¿no? Hay una desvinculación de quién soy yo, soy el alma, soy el órgano sexual, soy el cuerpo, y es como tremendo, y de repente esto, bueno, me reflejo completamente, ¿no? Cuando termina diciendo, no viene inspirado, nuestras relaciones no vienen inspiradas por un deseo genuino o una pasión genuina, sino ya todo está súper distorsionado, como dice, por la vergüenza y la culpa, está súper fuerte.
Claro. Sí. Bueno, ya verás cómo van a seguir hablando de esto mucho, ¿eh? Ya se va a aclarar más. Y la cosa es aquí, vamos a ver cómo lo comenta. Esta frase, ¿en qué queda, no? Porque ya digo que aquí hay que meterle ningún deseo o pasión deforme o perverso. Y la realidad es, vamos a ver lo que dice, que nuestra historia sexual.
The reality is, and this is a basic truth, that our sexual history was created most of the time by our unhealed emotions not related to sex at all.
O sea, esto sería un poco, que quizás es por lo que ha hablado Marisol también, por eso que no son los deseos perversos, sino que fue creada por estas emociones sin sanar, que encima, y además fijaros, contra lo que podría ser la creencia normal, no están relacionadas con el sexo para nada. Pero ahora va a poner ejemplos de esto y os van a salir, si queréis, y luego además podemos comentarlo al final de esta parte, o ahora sí surge también cosas concretas sobre que descubramos, se nos cae alguna ficha, ¿no? Sobre, claro, es que todo esto que yo había pensado que era un deseo perverso, lo que fuera, en realidad, todo lo que, cosas así, ¿no? O cosas que habríamos evitado siquiera pensarlas, como lo que dije del abuso sexual ese mío el otro día, que estaban ahí como en una nebulosa y que en realidad ahora ves que han condicionado, pero por eso que está todo ahí en una confusión de deseos y de historias, porque en realidad, bueno, eso.
But actually related to other emotions and feelings. So, as Mary's written there, most sexual injury is not related to sex. This is the sad irony of our inability to be open in the discussion. Because the sad irony is we don't want to be truthful and honest about our sexual history because we feel shame and guilt. Some of the shame is understandable because we did shameful things sometimes, and some of the shame is not understandable in that it was imposed upon us by our environment. But either way, we don't want to discuss it because at the end of the day, we feel there's something inside of us that must be terribly warped. Something inside of me, and it's interesting, many people on the planet feel this anyway, that there's something inside of me that's terribly badly damaged and warped, and there's something wrong with me. There's basically something intrinsically wrong with my nature that caused me to do this shameful thing that I remember in the past. And the reality is that most of the shameful things that we've done in the past, even the shameful things we've done sexually, are not related to sexual things at all. They're actually related to other emotions and the intensity of the other emotions driving this opening of our sexual desires. Remember the discussion we had earlier about the chakras and how they were in codependent sympathy in terms of the codependent addiction that's in sympathy between the male and female, creates an openness of a flow of energy, yes? And then in this process of this flow of emotional energy, we then feel what most of us would term sexual desire or horny. We feel horny or some kind of sexual desire. Now, many times these sexual desires are totally unrelated to things that we think they're related to. That's the sad thing. And our lack of ability to discuss it openly is actually making it more hidden than what it needs to be.
And it takes us further away from uncovering what's driving that injury, what's driving that desire. Yeah.
And so this is where it's very important with sexual attraction and sexual injuries. We need to start being willing to examine them, even though we are ashamed, or even though we have been ashamed of our past behaviour. We need to examine them. We need to stop justifying any behaviour that's out of harmony with the pure statement. And when I say we need to, it's up to you whether you do it. But if you want to be at one with God and you want to be at one with your soulmate, at some point there needs to be a recognition of any emotion that prevents those two things from being true. And the sexual history is guided by injuries not related to sex that we need to discuss. Otherwise, if we don't heal them, we'll end up feeling no closer to our soulmate and no closer to God eventually, because eventually we need to heal everything within us, including our sexual injuries, to be closer to God. Right? So that being the case, what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is we need to start discussing the link between sexual feelings and emotions that are in addiction with each other. Do you see that? We need to see the relationship between these two things. We need to understand more fully what sexual attraction really is. What actually...
Se ha fijado, ¿no? Se quedan emociones que no tienen nada que ver con el sexo, pues igual que como vimos con el tener hijos, que se tienen no por las razones de los hijos, sino para ser más mujeres, o sea, que están ahí mezcladas las heridas de los padres, siempre, ¿no? Lo que hemos asumido, incorporado muy pronto. Y os quiero comentar que va a poner ejemplos muy concretos. Van a ir preguntando cosas, va a ser muy entretenido en ese sentido. Y muy básico, a la vez, muy... Así que nada, si queréis...
causes this feeling of sexual attraction. And we've already discussed some of those things, but let's discuss it in a bit more detail regarding injuries. Shall we do that? In terms of how sexual attraction...
So we know that if we carry no injury, our sexual attraction is naturally and harmoniously only for our soulmate.
So that's the pure state.
That's the pure state. But the situation on the planet at the moment is that for most of us, we've got injuries around our sexuality. Yep. So when we're healed, it's only for our soulmate.
Sí, simplemente apuntan lo del estado puro, cuando estamos sanados, digamos.
Oye, Iván.
On that basis.
Sí.
Me acordé ahorita con la oración de la oración del amor divino, en la parte que dice: no somos las criaturas depravadas que los falsos maestros nos han hecho creer que somos. Claro. Y me llamó mucho la atención ahorita con esta parte de todas estas ideas o percepciones que tenemos sobre nosotros mismos que nos impiden vernos, ¿no? O sea, esa misma percepción, es tan doloroso esa percepción que nos impide examinar estas heridas.
Claro,
y cuando
sí, descifrar ahí, separar lo que es una emoción realmente que no tiene nada que ver, lo que es una práctica de sexo para tapar esa emoción, sí.
Sí, está interesante. Nada más quería comentar esa parte que sí a mí me llamó la atención, la pegué en mi recámara, la oración, y mi pareja cuando llega también me dice, ¿cómo? Pues yo nunca me he sentido como depravado o así, ¿no? Y digo, ok, bueno, está ahí la oración. Al final también el sentir que algo no está bien contigo, pues también puede ser un buen síntoma. O sea, puedes usarlo en el sentido de decir, bueno, aquí hay algo que examinar o lo puedes tapar. Pero si hay algo que sabes o presientes que no está bien, ese sentimiento que no es amoroso y de dónde viene, también podría ser un buen síntoma, ¿no? Saber que si me he sentido así en algún momento, hay algo ahí que examinar. Y justamente yo creo que es el síntoma que te lleva a buscar y a decir, bueno, es que yo tengo que explorar aquí y es lo que nos ha tenido buscando, pues, respuestas, ¿no?
Sí.
Bueno, gracias.
Ahí vamos.
Mary said. That's the basis that we start all of the discussions with. So if we assume for a moment, even though you may not believe that, let's just assume for a moment that this is the pure state. Let's just assume that that's the pure state. Can you see if that's the pure state, any time when we have felt differently to that must be an impure state or an unloving state?
Or injured. Can I say injured?
Should we call it injured state? Now,
con las emociones de vergüenza y culpa, los maestros que decía Marisol, que somos inconscientemente todos, los adultos de los niños, con esas vergüenzas y culpas sin palabras, estamos enseñando que son depravaciones en vez de ser estados heridos, en vez de ser que el alma está manchurrada, digamos, manchurroneada, pues nos enseñamos eso que ha dicho de depravado. Por eso la pareja de Marisol pues dice, no, pero si yo nunca me he sentido depravado, no, si es que en cuanto tenemos una vergüenza, ¿no? Es por esto, ¿no? Que hacemos esa distorsión en vez de verlo como Dios lo ve, ¿no? Simplemente es un alma que tiene una herida.
What we need to do firstly is we need to stop condemning ourselves for our injuries. You can't examine your injuries openly while you're condemning yourself for having them, right? Because it's the condemnation of them that causes us to go underneath and go, I don't want to know, I don't want to know, don't talk to me about that, right? That's what causes all of our injuries to go underground, our own judgmental attitude towards them. So what we need to do is say, all right, accept, yes, there's many times in my life when I have not felt this pure state. So that means in those times I was in an injured state. That's our first point that we need to be aware of. If I have not felt this state, then I was automatically in this state. Also, we need to stop condemning our injuries. We need to allow ourselves to see ourselves as we really are. We just had a discussion with Anna, where is she? Remember you were saying, hooray, I can see that I'm so ugly at the moment. Oh, whatever. I can see that I'm controlling. In other words, we can be happy that we can see the truth about ourselves, even when the truth isn't very pleasant.
And why were you happy, Anna?
If we use, yeah.
The epiphany of the pond scum. Because you feel joyful that you've heard for so long you're controlling, or you have these injuries, and then when you see it in your heart and you feel it, it's like, oh, I can finally see this and it feels good,
Yeah,
I can see all this error and it's exciting because I can finally see it.
Why is it exciting to see the error?
Because then it's like, then I know who I really am, and then I can work from there.
Yeah, you can change when you're just talking about it or thinking about it and not feeling it. How can you change?
I can't take any action.
It's just a concept. Yeah.
So the first point was that you know what you are at last, but the second point, which is the more important one, isn't it?
Because I can take.
I can change. Yeah. You see, while I'm trying to shove any shameful things under the carpet or any past history under the carpet or any of those kind of things, while I'm trying to put it under the carpet, I'm not able to change. I'm condemning myself to not change it. As soon as I can know what I am at last and see myself as I truly am in the mirror, I can now, there's this beauty in it, and that is I can change. I can get from this point to a different place. I can get from the injured state to the pure state if I want to. And it's all based on my desire. If I want to, I can get from that state to the other. Okay.
Anna and I were laughing because I was saying, yes, I know I'm pond scum. I'm lower than low.
It comes from a movie, actually.
Yeah.
But anyway.
That was the point.
Una cosa que ha dicho de una película y no lo han traducido. Y Mary simplemente redunda en eso de, bien, ahora sé que soy no sé qué. Y viene de una película, dice Miller. Así que ya sabéis, ya que he parado, digo esto, ya estamos todos confesando a nuestros espíritus ahí desarmónicos que están en nuestras heridas, ya les estamos confesando a ver que no se atreven a ver de sus vidas pasadas. Ahora tenéis que convertiros todas en curas y curos. Que ya les hicimos la oración aquella, tenemos que hacerla más. Para que vengan guías y nos ayuden a confesarlos. Bueno, fuera de bromas.
Scum analogy.
Yeah. Not many get it. Because
No, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look
Iván,
at... Sí.
me demora en activar el micrófono, perdón. Quería decir justo cuando usaste la palabra confesión, un poco también esto que decía Marisol al principio, no en esta puntualmente, pero en la anterior intervención, que esto que también consideramos que por ahí que es al otro, como que hay que reconocer a un otro, por ejemplo, hablo ya sea el terapeuta, la pareja, pero que en realidad la dificultad más grande la tenemos con nosotros mismos.
Sí.
Porque es lo que yo veo en mí, por ejemplo, que el engaño era para conmigo. O sea, mi gran bloqueo es mi versión falsa, digamos, mi máscara. Por decirte, entonces de alguna forma comprendo que no quería declararlo para no asumirlo, que es un poco esto de la máscara de la autodependencia y todo esto que tenemos muy nueva era, digamos. Que claro, vamos ya airosos, con todo resuelto, pero sin haber atravesado justamente esto que ellos están diciendo. No queremos saber la verdad sobre nosotros mismos porque nos avergonzamos. E incluso conocí personas que ahora comprendo que eran las que me juzgaban en su momento cuando me decían, vos tenés que tener algún problema, que participaban en fiestas, ya era el otro extremo, digamos, sexuales. Otro extremo, digo, no estaba restringido a una relación de pareja, sino que la práctica de la sexualidad era ya más degenerada, deformada. Y bueno, entonces era claro también, y representa esto, si se quiere, tampoco era su atracción ni su deseo, sino que era la máscara otra vez, llevando al extremo esa libertad, entre comillas, que no es real, digamos, ahora me doy cuenta.
Sí.
Entonces sí, comprendo que esa confesión para conmigo es la parte más difícil, si se quiere, porque claro, la escondí, la recontra escondí.
Claro, y es ahí,
gracias,
a partir de que podamos entrar en esas heridas nuestras, como podremos facilitar también que sean desalojadas de los espíritus.
Exacto.
De los desencarnados.
Sí, eso me hiciste pensar justo, porque sentí todo este tiempo, siento el frío, el miedo, están acá. Tengo enfrente el dibujo que se suele ver en los vivos y recordé esto que estás diciendo cuando dijiste ahora a contar a los desencarnados y confesar, claro, que en realidad ellos conocen también, o sea, estamos unidos por las heridas, capaz las conocen más que yo, por eso me han elegido. Y entiendo que sí, que a mí en primera persona, esa falta de humildad, digamos, me está afectando. La arrogancia de querer sostener esa fachada para mí misma. O sea, que en la sexualidad nadie sabe, yo no conté nada, pero tampoco me conté la verdad a mí. Eso quería decir, como que de todas las confesiones posibles, la más importante y la esencial es con Dios, y que Él está sabiendo la verdad, pero me falta a mí. Él no puede, digamos, sí me ha mostrado, he tenido experiencias, en las que me ha puesto la vergüenza, digamos, a disposición, pero claro, la tapé. Entiendo, sí.
Vale, pues
Gracias.
la vamos a ir traspasando. Oye, ¿me oís ahora mejor? Porque he movido una rueda del micrófono que no había movido hace mucho tiempo. No sé si me oye demasiado. ¿Se me oye diferente?
No, más nítido.
Vale, pues ya está.
Ajá, más claro.
Bien.
That we may do particular things in. All right? And let's, rather than condemning this injured state, let's start examining what is actually going on in terms of, from an emotional perspective, what is actually happening, denial of what emotions. Now, what are some of the most taboo sexual practices that you can think of that most people, you know, don't even want to discuss?
I don't know how to spell it.
So,
Pedophilia.
pedophilia, in other words, sex with children or desire for sex with children. Yes.
Sex with animals.
Right, bestiality. Is it with an A? I don't think it is.
Bad spelling, both.
And
behind as
and
well.
behind it.
Anal sex.
Sorry?
Anal
sex, yes. Necrophilia. Necrophilia, which is sex with dead people. Is it?
Yep.
Yeah. I'll write it as that rather than necrophilia. Yep. Diana?
Incest.
Incest, which we've got as pedophilia, yeah?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Or
it's a little
incest, if you
different.
like, yeah.
Both,
Let's put it in there, yeah?
Sometimes that's adult.
Yeah. What else? Joy, thank you.
Forced sex, like
Rape.
rape, anything that's like bondage or that sort of stuff.
Oh, okay.
So there's a difference between those two, because one of them is
with
what do they call it?
Consensual.
I was going to say,
And the other one is
bondage can be one or the other as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go for
What does S&M stand for? That's what they call it, isn't it? The sadism and masochism.
S&M.
Yeah.
Bondage. And that's different to things like rape and abuse, right?
So, yep, swinging.
Swinging?
Yep. That's like where you swap partners.
Swap partners.
Yep.
Partner swapping. How are you all feeling?
Is everyone breathing? I can see this is another beautiful image for the next media expose.
Yeah. Don't think that's what we're promoting.
Yeah. Injured. Yeah.
Prostitution,
yep. Groups. So
sex?
threesomes or more, yep.
Aquí el público lo va diciendo y lo oyen de lejos.
A tantric sacred sex.
I'm just going to put inverted commas around the sacred there.
Because a lot of it is not very sacred. Yeah. Masturbation, yes. So that's okay. There are many religions who also condemn oral sex. Right. In fact, there's many religions that condemn sex for any other purpose other than having a child.
Yeah. So pleasure, sexual pleasure.
Sexual pleasure itself. But let's leave that out for a moment. I think most of us are. Joy, thank you.
And that's one, like religions is like denied sex, like.
Yes, having this viewpoint that holy means to be totally without sex.
What is that called?
Aquí la mujer ha hablado de las religiones que niegan el sexo. Sí. Tienen este punto de vista, añade Miller.
Celibate.
Celibacy.
Thanks, well.
Mary's almost as bad as me now.
Oh, serious.
She's getting worse.
I told you I'd take on all your traits.
My terrible influences.
Aquí bromea con que ha sido mala influencia para Mary porque a él se le da muy mal, además de que es zurdo, es como si fuera disléxico con las letras, o sea, la ortografía no es lo suyo y Mary como que se está contagiando.
For spelling is getting into and
like a kind of dirty sex, like sex while menstruation.
Ah, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
What do you call that?
Sex and menstruation. I'm
yeah.
gonna call it.
Then you have things like weeing on people, which is more like a degradation type of.
Yeah.
So
sort of does that
sexual
fit in
degradation.
Bondage? Yeah.
Yeah. Any others you can think of? It's amazing how many things we've come up.
What was Karen had one?
What was Karen going to say?
Homosexuality.
Homosexuality, yeah, even that is considered.
And can we put bisexuality as well?
I don't know if it sort of makes.
It's not really. I don't know if it's an injury, but bisexuality.
Yes, let's put bisexuality because there is a feeling that homosexuality on the planet is an injured state, but
it's a taboo.
Yeah. By the way, we're not saying all of these are injured states. What we're saying is we want to just, write down all of those things. So maybe we should include homosexuality. Because we're not saying they're all injured states. What we're saying is, because some of them are and some of them aren't, what we're saying is we have all of these different belief systems about them. Yep. Voyeurism, yes, that's good.
VOYUE.
EU. Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose you could say.
Oh, promiscuity, maybe.
Consecutive monogamy. Most of us have done that, I think.
Serial monogamy.
Ya no hay suficientes arreglos.
No, se están.
Beauty, yeah, where you've got more than one thing at the same time.
Sex with clients.
Sex with clients. Is that a possibility?
I don't know. Like I heard a guy. He shared a story that he scratched a hole into a tree and put a bit meat in it, and then did it.
Fair enough. So.
Inanimate objects.
So let's call it inanimate objects, like use of inanimate objects.
Yeah.
And should we include in that things like vibrators, blow-up dolls, all those kind of things, shall we?
Inanimate.
I-N-A-N-I-M-A-T. Sorry, what was that one? Fruits and vegetables. Okay. Use of inanimate objects, yeah.
Okay.
Asphyxiation, yes?
Yes, that's common, isn't it? Now, all these words, how do you spell it?
How do you spell asphyxiation? Go on. A-S-P-H.
Y-X-iation. It's
where somebody
said to heighten your sexual pleasure when you
constrict your flow.
Don't have oxygen to your brain. Yeah. Oral sex got that.
We've almost covered most, I think, haven't we? No, I haven't exhausted the list.
Karen had one. What was that one? Pornography.
Pornography,
yeah.
Very good.
Very good. Yeah.
Drugs, yeah, so drugs with sex, yeah. We could put that in there somewhere.
Alcoholics. Are we going to go through all of these, babe?
We're not going to get to go through all of these, obviously. Any more you can think of while we're at it? Rituals, yes, sexual rituals.
Exhibitionism?
Exhibitionism. And what's the other? So that's very similar. Let's sex with dead people. I probably should have written that as a
necrophilia.
So exhibitionism. We're doing pretty good. I'm starting to worry about all of this.
I know. Mutilation of the sexual organs of young children.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd include that as a sexual. To me, that's just
Child abuse.
Violent abuse. Yeah, just general abuse. Yeah. Okay, well, that's a good enough list to start with, isn't it? Now, every one of these things has an emotional cause, most of which are not connected with sex itself. Now, some of these things are pure. For example, homosexuality. There can be pure homosexuality in the sense that, remember we said, when healed, sexual attraction was only for your soulmate. And if your soulmate happens to be of the same gender that you are, then of course that means it's a homosexual relationship. So homosexuality could be a pure thing, could it not? Right? So some of those things are pure. Some of them are actually like quite negative towards yourself in the sense of they have quite a lot of different unloving emotions involved with different things. And what we need to do is we need to examine these things with a lot more clarity. Now, let's firstly deal with masturbation, because it's one of the easiest to deal with. There's a lot of sexual to do about masturbation, a lot of jokes about it and so forth, isn't there? You know, if a person's caught masturbating, they usually make you feel quite terrible about themselves and so forth. But the reality is quite simple. If you can't and are not allowed to touch yourself sexually, then why is anybody else allowed to touch you sexually? So to me, the whole reason why masturbation is treated as a taboo is because there is a general shame that people have about touching themselves sexually and getting pleasure from their own touch. Right? So there's a general shame present. But what happens though with masturbation is you could say sometimes masturbation is taken to the extreme.
So an addiction to masturbation.
So in other words, it becomes an addiction. Do you follow me? So a person may masturbate on a fairly regular basis, but then it may become an extreme. Now, of course, different psychologists will tell you different things about what the extreme is, you know. But in the end, much masturbation begins from a very, very simple emotion. It's a feeling of sadness about not being loved. Just simple emotion that we're just trying to avoid by having a sexual feeling instead. And in fact, the interesting things about most of the things that are written here, not all of them, but most of them, is they all come from some kind of emotional hurt or injury as to why we have that particular desire.
So masturbation is, many people are made to feel like they're very shameful and there's something wrong with them sexually, when in fact the core reason that a person...
Aquí se refiere a la masturbación, da mucha vergüenza en singular, que hay algo malo en ellas, en las personas al hacerlo sexualmente, cuando la realidad sigue.
May masturbate compulsively is simply about a sense of like avoiding their own loneliness and sadness.
Now the same thing applies.
Pues si queréis hacemos una pausa, comentamos un poco y luego seguimos en otra grabación. Porque ahora van a pasar por unas cuantas así. Se va a poner muy interesante, van a hablar del celibato también después. Y podéis comentar algo si queréis, si tenéis algo pendiente.
Pues por mí podríamos seguir. El tema es que si se alarga, o sea, tú checa en los contenidos. por mí está bien, pero si quieres lo cortamos por el tema de que se alarga mucho el video en sí mismo, ¿no? ¿Cómo ven?
Sí, por eso. Si queréis comentar algo. Y si no, pues...
No, por ahí de alguna forma lo recurrente en todas las oportunidades que tenemos justamente es que todo es un escenario para conocer la verdad. Es lo que siento y cómo de alguna forma volvemos a encontrarnos con esa amorosidad en el diseño. Así sea, por ejemplo, en este último caso que desarrolla, la masturbación, como entenderla como, digamos, una adicción para evitar la propia soledad y la tristeza. O sea, qué tan distorsionados estamos de eso, de considerar, en vez de considerar una oportunidad, de condenarlo y juzgarlo. Por lo tanto, bueno, no evita que se lo haga, sino que se lo esconde. Digamos, se sigue haciendo y se lo esconde.
Sí, y muy
y es eso que decían decía esto, que nos perdemos de la alegría de encontrarnos, como en un momento, y me gustó mucho eso, cuando le hablaron a Ana, y dijo, uno realmente siente que la verdad, digamos, no es dolorosa en sí, sino que es nuestra resistencia a conocerla lo que nos duele, pero la verdad libera y da alegría, sí. Esa es realmente la sensación.
No, y es increíble. Sí, Ana.
Rescato lo que dice Claudia y la forma en que Mary y AJ, digamos, esta cuestión de reconocerse, sí, soy esto, soy lo otro, reconocer esa herida, no quedarse en eso, sino saber que tenemos la posibilidad de cambiar. Y el detalle de ir en profundo sobre estos temas, las perversiones, la homosexualidad, esas prácticas, es interesante. Me animaría yo como para a compartirlo en los grupos de adolescentes, que es por el poco conocimiento que tengo, como que tienen mayor apertura para charlar de este tipo de cosas.
Sí, la clave que han dicho ahí era que, o sea, la clave es que si no lo queremos reconocer, no podemos cambiar. O sea, si no queremos darnos cuenta de cuál es, sí, nuestra emoción, la que está causando, pues no podemos cambiar nada. Y claro, y esa ignorancia y no querer llorar la tristeza de que nadie nos quiera, por así decirlo, ahí se anidan todas esas industrias de la pornografía, etcétera, donde vamos por donde van a seguir ahora. Y además hay que contar también con que la sociedad también incluye a miles de millones de espíritus que están ahí a la que salta, como vimos, para incluso llegar a ocupar los cuerpos de los niños cuando son abusados, etcétera, y van ahí enfervorecidos completamente en frenesí con la adicción a sentir cosas sexuales, que parece que es la más potente, ¿no? Se dice que la industria pornográfica es lo que más mueve dinero junto con algunas otras, ¿no? O por lo menos movía. Ahora a ver cómo... Bueno,
claro, y aparte, o sea, cómo lo exponen con la naturalidad que es, ¿no? Que es como muy difícil encontrar los espacios en donde se toquen temas sin el juicio y la condenación. Y eso pues abre toda la posibilidad de que podamos explorarnos, y incluso se siente, o sea, hablar de estos temas, cómo lo exponen, la gente se anima a hablar. Primero no hablaban mucho y luego se empiezan a animar todos a hablar y a como empieza a fluir, ¿no? Toda pues, la exposición, y es muy interesante. Entonces, mucho es primero pues sanas tu propia vergüenza con respecto al tema para que lo puedas también exponer. Por ejemplo, yo me imagino con los hijos, ¿no? Hablarlo así tan abiertamente como lo está exponiendo Miller, o como dice Ana, en las escuelas. Para empezar, no debemos de tener esta condenación por todas estas prácticas, y la hay. Entonces, bueno,
Sí.
pues eso sería como lo más importante para empezar.
Sí, de eso van a hablar más ahora, sí. Van a insistir mucho en eso. Sí, de no condenar, porque entonces no se puede sentir el deseo y la emoción como errores, sino que ya se siente solo el juicio, o sea, emociones de efectos secundarias, de juicio, de vergüenza. Todo eso, sí, sí. Bueno, pues...
Ok,
ahora
gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Y despediros así, nos despedimos grupalmente de nuestro amado público, 1.500.000 suscriptores que tenemos ya. Y
Gracias, Iván.
gracias.
Gracias, gracias, gracias.